Thank you, Mabel, Parismita, Saba, for wonderful papers this morning. I would like to begin by asking a question that those of you who participated in our reading groups last year have heard me ask in other ways, and I think all papers address in diverse but connected ways, which is, what are the aesthetics and art that is emerging from this time of climate crisis, catastrophe, change, whether we call it the Anthropocene or not? And what are the old stories we are retelling? So not just to think about this as a kind of paradigm shift, but in some ways a part of a historical and perhaps long historical, geological, and myth-making process, and what are other stories we might tell, a question I asked yesterday. I do think that the three papers this morning responded beautifully to our call for this group to think about climate change and contemporary cultural production in South Asia as more than responses to death, dispossession, disaster, and dystopia, which of course they certainly are, but to also think about new modes of expression, creativity, resilience, resistance that are emerging, to think about various forms of creative work, to think about, as Mabel did, geology and geography as science, as a kind of creative work and response to current conditions, to think about fiction, visual art, music, performance, but also, I think Parismita made very clear, political rhetoric and social media reels as forms of creative expression to which we are responding. And then in Saba's paper, I think we saw quite clearly fiction, of course, post-colonial climate fiction, in some ways the object of her analysis as a response to climate change, but also forms of ritual, forms of animal rearing, forms of making ice as responses to contemporary conditions. I really loved the way in which the papers, and this was not planned because, as you can imagine, I had no access to the papers until quite recently, that we are invited to think about melts and bursts as more than environmental or economic or empirical, but to think about the imaginative possibilities of melts and bursts, to think about magic and tricks and indigenous knowledges and knowledge formation. So in other words, none of these papers presented indigenous knowledge as a kind of reified object, but that's something that is still being made through resistance to dam projects or to ways in which people are finding new ways to live and work. There's lots of theoretical provocations that I imagine we'll take up as a group, the idea of climate as object and climate as condition, the connection between not geopolitics, but geopoetics and decoloniality, which I think connects very well to questions that Esra asked yesterday about how what we're speaking about in South Asia extends beyond South Asia, perhaps to the global South, or really to the global South and North in a new configuration. Let me ask a few things that came up in terms of what I think might have not been fully addressed by the papers, but that did make me curious. And I do think this extends to some of the papers we heard yesterday too. This particular set, I thought, and I was quite struck by this, addressed what is often in scholarship called borderlands, peripheries, frontiers, and contact zones, and none of the papers used that language, which in some ways I really appreciated, frankly. There was a way in which the kind of social scientific determinism that I find very difficult given my own area of interest, and not to say that borderlands, peripheries, contact zones, and frontiers in and of themselves need to be deterministic, but in the way that they're used, you often kind of know, at least for me, in a social science monograph, where the story is going. And in this case, none of these papers use that language. At the same time, I saw very clear intersections between what we were hearing today and scholarship by a range of scholars with which, of course, you will all be familiar, from Willem van Schendel to James C. Scott, Malini Sur on one set of borderlands, Noshin Ali, Navida Khan, Benjamin Hopkins, Berenice Guerrero-Richard, Jason Kahns, Dali Kikon, Duncan McDouey Ra. And I'm actually here pointing to a very robust body of scholarship that's emerged around borderlands in South Asia. So in other words, not borderlands anywhere, not the US-Mexico border, not the Palestine-Israel borders, but really something that is quite specific to the vast and diverse, but still nameable or identifiable area that we call South Asia. And the Himalayas are kind of one connecting thread through these papers and through some of the scholarship I've named. The Indian Ocean has emerged in recent scholarship as another way to think about the place of South Asia in the world. How some of this scholarship relates to earlier scholarship on South Asia as subcontinent, I think, is also worth maybe thinking about in terms of an invitation to think about histories, temporalities, and languages in a longue durée. So let me end with a couple of thoughts around these problems, which is, I really did appreciate the way in which all of these papers drew on a range of scholars that we're familiar with, from Leanne Simpson to Michael Tausig to Sarah Ahmed, Vine Deloria, and so on, to really broaden the scope of what we're doing beyond thinking about South Asia. But I couldn't help but wonder, what is particular to South Asia or about South Asia? Is there something, could our project really just kind of become universalized or abstracted to thinking about climate change anywhere in the global South? Or are there particular formations that we're seeing, developments and formations that we're seeing, imaginations at work in South Asia that are distinct? And what would theorizing, not from the South and not only from the global South, but from South Asia look like? What are not just practices or discourses, but theories that are emerging from the body of work that we heard in the presentations this morning, but also yesterday? I'm thinking very much of Rupali, Farhan, Emily's work, that there's lots of connections, I think, that we might as a group think about. And so with that, I'm going to invite our panelists to enter the conversation as they wish, and then of course I will open it up to all of you.
So, it's a lot of questions. I think that question about not using the word borderland, frontier, this was not planned, but now that you bring it up, it's something that, a lot of, especially the language of frontier, is one that, me and some other scholars working in the region have been pushing against because of its kind of colonial and even its post-colonial kind of, legacies, and how, that reproduces a lot of the ways in which even the word Northeast India is seen as, where is the center then? So, and I think that's the kind of limitation of like South Asian studies because of, or where the moment of partition like over-determines a lot of our scholarship, and that's what a lot of Himalayan studies scholars have written about. If you think about places like Nepal, Bhutan, and even Sikkim, that Sikkim had British presence, but they were not part of the British India, like Nepal and Bhutan, were not part of the British India Empire, and they had stronger linkages with Tibet, political, spiritual, military, economic connections, even Ladakh in Northwest India, and I'm sure like many other places. So I think that has been one moment. It's been something I've been thinking about, how to think about these different histories. And I don't know if scholars have used the language of settler colonialism when they think about Kashmir And I'm not sure, like, I think I'm still working out if that language applies, but I do think there's this colonial imperial kind of ambition. So I talked about Sikkim being a Tibetan Buddhist monarchy, and that started in the 17th century. So there's this book that kind of talks about Sikkim, how, it was incorporated in the Tibetan Buddhist kind of idea by incorporating these indigenous communities, not just the Lepchas, but Limbus and other kind of non-Buddhist communities. And religion kind of played a huge role in that. And Tibet, kind of also had this military economic kind of impulse to incorporate the peripheries. And so it's been very interesting to think about this question of racialization also, but not, just thinking about caste or racial difference from the British or the Indian context, but even how the Tibetan state looked at non-Buddhist peripheral communities as barbarians that had to be kind of incorporated into Buddhism and civilized. So that example of the magical contest between Tibetan Buddhist gurus and indigenous ritual specialists, is also a very significant kind of political and spiritual kind of moment, because it talks about at the end, the Tibetan Buddhist, like in most stories, is able to conquer the local, ritual practitioner, and that kind of signals the entry of Tibetan Buddhism. But it's not, just this complete kind of erasure of the indigenous religion, because it incorporates it, but kind of develops into this, there's some parallels that you can make with Hindu, religion, where that, incorporates traditional indigenous kind of vernacular stories, that what I was talking about. But there's a way in which there has been like a hybrid, and I know religious studies scholars don't like the word hybrid religion, but there is this hybridity where you still have the Lepcha community practicing, Tibetan Buddhism alongside their ritual practices. There's a lot of tensions, and you see Lepcha kind of ritual practices disappearing, and that has been a big concern. And this is just an example to think about, for me it has been interesting to think about racialization, and but shifting the center from not thinking about just the partition as this kind of important. For many northeastern states, the partition was something that incorporated them into the Indian state, and it was a moment that many of these places like Nagaland, Mizoram were fighting for their own sovereignty, and see the Indian state as the continuation of the British colonization. So. And I think that's where I found it helpful to look at indigenous scholars in the North American context, and I cite a few of them, especially in this idea of how the landscape is seen as a wasteland or inhospitable and remote. And I think that's where there are ways in which we can, be in conversation with scholars from the Caribbean, as I was citing, and other places, even here in the North American context, ideas of manifest destiny. I think what is happening with the Hindu territorial expansion, there's very kind of similar, ways in which there's an incorporation of these indigenous communities through kind of this language of Akhand Bharat, which is a greater India, that kind of sees these communities, indigenous communities, as always already Hindu. So. But I do think, and this is something that came up in the last few sessions, about the role of wetness, the monsoons, the role of earthquakes and landslides, the Himalayan kind of tectonic uplift. That does give the sense of specificity and particularity that I was kind of trying to get at in my work around the landscape. So I think that's where maybe, as we're talking about the next monsoon, where we can think about South Asia as doing something different.
Sabah, do you mind if I ask you to go third? Or unless you want to jump in now?
Yeah.
Can you see us? I'm sort of not sure where I should be looking. The person who went to
Should I just go in? Yeah. Right, yes. Yes, thank you for the question. So like Mabel, I'll also take, okay. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So yes, the question of the borderlands. Yeah, I was very, very conscious of the fact of the readings I was citing. And so yes, so one is that, of course, I mean, that's something that I wanted to get into as a part of the paper, but I couldn't do so because because of the time. One is that first of all, it's like it was a formal exercise, like a formal experiment to go with to leave the city unnamed and the region unnamed. Yeah, so that is one. And two is for a graphic novelist to do this without images. Yeah, so that, yes, it was, so, I didn't, and so apologies to Daniel, I didn't reply to that email because I had a PowerPoint. And all the time I was like, do I not? Do I send this in? Do I exhibit it or not? And eventually I took a call not to. So both questions, and both of these are in a sense sort of related. Because again, when it comes to a formal thing, I'm a writer, and I've really enjoyed engaging with scholarship, but I don't come from your discipline. I mean, I don't come from a specific discipline of anthropology or a social science person, but I've really, really thoroughly enjoyed engaging with all of this, but in a slightly delinquent manner, as you can see. And it is there, it's there in the traces, because I'm literally savoring and picking and choosing, and but it's been like at a buffet. It's been a very enjoyable experience. But yes, I have to also put that out, that this is not scholarship. I mean, I'm engaging with scholarship in a slightly delinquent fashion. And but yes, this question of borderlands, and the fact that I've left the city unnamed and the region unnamed. So it worked too. So one, it was at one level, it was very disorienting for me to do this. And also it was very freeing. But at the same time, and this is something that is, of course, work in progress, and it's something that I'm going to think through and work out and see how that fits into the scheme of the paper and how and the questions I'm raising. The other thing is that, but it's also interesting because I feel that so I don't use the term, for instance, Northeast India, right? But so it's odd because I don't use the term, but I use it. Because this is obviously a category that it is a category that is that I'm using very much because I keep talking of the neighboring state and the neighboring state and the neighboring region and this region and the city and all these terms, right? So all of it would have been convenient to just use the term Northeast India. So and that too, but I'd also like to say that I have used, I do acknowledge, and I'm very, very conscious of the fact of its colonial heritage and the fact that this is not a term that if, about 10 years, 20 years ago, no one identified themselves as being from Northeast India. It was something that other people used for you. But at the same time, I have also, so when I edited a book a couple of years ago, and I invited people from artists and writers from many of this region, I did use the term Northeast India there. But I tried to reclaim it, and I tried to use it also as a creative, as a creative category. So in a sense, what I always say about this is that I inhabit this category, and I also resist it. And as writers, we are allowed contradiction. But it is not without conflict. It is not without conflict, is what I want to say, and that this is. So I acknowledge all the dynamics at play here, and. Because I think you can also use this category to go beyond the geography, especially if you use like poetics, if you ask writers, and if the category of Northeast India can also be a creative category, which where we look at like say the category of the Himalayas now, so a lot of artists and writers back in India. On the Himalaya, not in India actually, that the Himalayan region, which is also Bhutan and Nepal and all these regions. So that also is an interesting space where a lot of artists are beginning to talk across and have conversations across. And I'd also like to hope that the term Northeast India, as well as borderlands, at least for creative practitioners, that we have this as a space where we are able to engage beyond colonial categories, beyond borders and things like that. Yes.
All right, so I can see that there's a number of questions in the room, but I'm going to turn it over to Saba, and then the first round of questions is Farhan, Kadri, Nayonika. Next round, Parag, Mona, and then that's where we are now. Okay, so Saba, go ahead.
You will hear me okay?
Yes, we can, and I'm just moving. Okay. Can you see? I don't even know whether that's better or this is better. Where is the camera? Doesn't matter. Okay, doesn't matter. Okay. Yes, Saba, would you like to respond to that round of comments, or?
Yes. I'm really sorry. I think I correct me if I'm wrong. I couldn't fully hear the question, but I think the terms that you were talking about, which I can respond to, I think you talked about borderlands, right? and this idea of theorization through South Asian literature and art. Is that what we're talking about? Yes?
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay, great. Thank you so much, first of all, for taking the time to read through our papers and give us such incisive feedback. I really appreciate that. I think my colleagues have put it really well, but I think I'd like to add to their points about thinking, I think about the constructedness of borders, especially when we look at, I think through the lens of Pakistani fiction, especially Uzma Khan's work, there's a concerted attempt to deconstruct the idea of Pakistan as just a Muslim state, a nation state, by putting together this idea of the ecological space. So you're also seeing this idea of nationalist borders being kind of deconstructed through the novel, but also making us think about how natural disasters, especially climate change, will destabilize these borders. And increasingly, we are facing those onslaughts with the passage of time. So I think literature plays a very important role in making us think about how these borders are permeable and porous when it comes to the onslaught of climate change, and we need to think about them and think around them and think about ways to address them, which is where I think Usma Khan's work is very important, because it shifts away from the doom and gloom narratives that you find predominantly in climate change debates and concerns. And that's not to say that's not important, but I think we're also increasingly, in parts of the world that we're living in, we're facing climate change on an increasingly frequent basis. So we also need to think about how do we tackle climate change, how do we address climate change, and it's very important to go back to indigenous knowledge and practices that have always been there but have been deliberately erased and marginalized. So it's not, I think, creating something new. It's a matter of going back to excavating or reclaiming what was already there, which were traditional ways of ecologically existing with the land or existing in a more sustainable manner. So I think these are the ways that, through looking at place-based scholarship, which is what South Asian fiction and art offers, you get a more informed sense of the context, the particularities through which we can think through these specific places and sites in thinking about the dynamics of climate change and how to deal with it. And I think also this idea of insider knowledge, not looking outwards, not looking to experts from abroad to come and tell us how to, develop our areas or to improve our areas, but to look within and to reclaim those, I think, marginalized subjects or people who we have marginalized in our quest for development, and to learn from that insider knowledge as a means of adaptation and mitigation of climate.
Thank you. All right, so we'll take a first round of questions, and I'll ask you to ask for all the panelists to wait until we hear 3 questions so that we can go through a second round. Farhan, Kadri, Nayanika. Oh, I thought you had a hand up. Okay, all right, then it's Kadri, Nayanika, and Parag is 3. And then the next round is Mona, Rupali, Anuradha, Nida, Iftikhar. Okay. All right. Kadri, go ahead.
Do I need a mic? Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so thank you for those wonderful papers. Again, lovely start to the day. I just want to, I guess my questions are about method / scholarly performativity. Actually inspired by Parismita's wonderful performance of her, the way in which she interrogates location and what is made visible, right, by eschewing the images, which I very much appreciated, and I got it. Thank you. So I guess, so I don't really have a question for Parismita, just appreciation. But then to Mabel, it struck me that you are very productively bringing in these theorists from global indigenous communities. And so I didn't quite understand whether your work is ethnographic, like did you do field work? And if so, do you feel like, or did you do the activists you're working with also know about these other theorizations? Are they in conversation with them? Or did you feel like you wanted to foster that kind of conversation to build a global solidarity? So that's kind of one question to you, and then to Sabah. I'm often struck by the way in which many literary critical takes on, climate-related texts don't really address questions of form and voice, right? I mean, it's like, how are you treating the novel? Is it an archive? Is it theory? Vis-a-vis climate change. What happened to that thing we used to do where we looked at form and voice, questions of mediation, genre, etc. And I mean, I was struck also by that because, I might be wrong, but isn't Uzma Khan a kind of diasporic novelist? So how does that come into the questions of borderland, location, etc.?
Thanks, this is such a great panel. Is this working?
Yes. Okay. Could somebody please, sorry, repeat the question? I think Mona said something about my method, or I didn't fully get that question.
Hi. I hope. So I have two questions, and I think they're largely for the panel. So firstly, thank you, three really wonderful papers. I learned a lot from them. First question is for Sabah and for Mabel, which is on the category of the indigenous and indigenous knowledges. And I wonder, I'm just going back to sort of older critiques in anthropology about how it is impossible to disentangle the indigenous from other kinds of knowledges, right? For instance, the ways in which the state has imposed its own knowledge practices onto indigenous communities. In the context of India, maybe we talked about the Akhand Bharat project. We've been hearing about internationalism, the ways in which the state is being marshaled and is being, scolarizing all sorts of new ways. So I've wondered about this implicit and sometimes explicit work, which is not just which is there in a lot of the climate literature, which is about the recovery of the indigenous voice. And I wondered about, I'm not saying that we can't do that, but I wondered about how one could do that critically, that one could do that in a way that is productive for the kind of climate knowledge that also doesn't romanticize or isolate the indigenous in some way. I had a second question, which is for the whole panel, I think, in a way, which is, so I see the point of, focusing on romance, on resistance, on humor, which is, I think, something you could see in all the papers, especially given how apocalyptic a lot of climate literature again is, coming out of South Asia, the kind of critical ways in which it feels very dystopic and feels very hopeless and very, very, like, it's all over, it's all finished. But I also then wondered about what are, the politics of focusing on, for instance, romance or resistance or humor. And I think it's really important to do it. But again, I'm posing the question to the panel as, being the times advocate here, that what is the politics to do that in this moment, where we also know that these dystopic narratives are quite true. As someone who works on the Upper Himalaya, I hear them all the time, I see them all the time. I work in a place that literally doesn't exist anymore. So there is a lot of truth to that dystopic vision of what's happening.
Thank you to all the three panelists for the wonderful presentations. My question is, because again, I would just be a little partial that Mabel and Parishka's presentation kind of directly talks to what I'm doing. And especially some of the quiet I witnessed myself because I was currently doing archive when this happened. But the question of ice and rope is something I will start with the thing that when Mabel pointed out that there's only one specialist who had done the IPCC report, I feel that's a very norm for hydropower construction all over Northeast and many other places now, where activists have been pointing out that all these studies are done just by helicopter service. They don't even land on the soil because there's no place to land at all. So that is one. But on the other hand, also I was thinking that what Mabel was suggesting about insurgent geologists, and I was really excited to see Catherine Yusuf's book, and I remember what I was reading there. But the thing about how within the region that is categorically known, like for Indian state as Northeast, there's so many different stages of understanding the land or understanding the environment or the Himalayas is happening. And I'm saying this because where in one place you are telling the story of how geologists are working against the state, there's also a point where they are directly coming out and saying, and I'm particularly talking about the Subansiri River Hydroelectric project, which I work on, but also one of the very first projects to start, but took so long because it was told by an expert committee set up by the government of India and Assam that don't build a dam there. But then the art of state again comes in to build committees after committees after committees to find a way to build that dam. So how this expert, if I have to borrow Timothy Mitchell, there are expertise that help us build that, but how do you then think of conflict of expertise? How expertise, if they conflict within each other, then what sustains? What state allows us to sustain the art of state? What happens there? So this is something I was thinking. But finally, the question that I think, as someone who works on Northeast always bothers, or any borderland area, that whose borderland is for whom it is a borderland. And I think because again I work on infrastructure, that how when infrastructure enters into these so-called borderlands, what do they do? How these infrastructures come to connect a place that is borderland, but in the process in the name of connecting, it also reiterates the framing. And then it just doesn't enter into a natural landscape, but it also enters into a social landscape. So to say that it may change the landscape, but at the same time it also changes societies with more money, more claims, and then I think Medura and some others have done how how societies within themselves, with the money that they get, have given rise to conflicts themselves. So I was just wondering that when we are talking about sometimes doing away with such categories, how do we then think about the claims that are coming from the region? As someone who is working there, I have heard a lot of stories in Arunachal Pradesh where ghost villages come within overnight. Whenever there is a new project, let's say some land will be taken. So overnight there is a ghost village to claim land patras. This is our land because they're remuneration. So how
Interject because we are running short of time, and I know there's lots more questions and discussion in the room. May I invite the panelists to respond to this round very briefly, in the interest that we might get at least another round, maybe a round and a half of at least questions in before our time is up in about 10 minutes. So quick responses, maybe. Go ahead, Saba.
Yeah, so this question about my method, which I guess I should have, I think, explicitly talked about a little bit more. What I'm offering is an eco-critical analysis of the novel, which is, I guess, my methodology for the paper. And I'm sure you would know it's a multidisciplinary way of looking at literature. So I'm not just drawing on literary theory, I'm looking at geology, I'm looking at geography, I'm looking at cultural studies. Sometimes I even touch upon sociology, and those are some of the theorists and the ways that I'm framing ways of looking at climate change through the novel. As far as that question about, I think, romanticizing indigenous practices goes, I don't think that was my intent. My intent was to talk about the strategies with which indigenous people are responding to climate change, and that's a specific entry point into the ways that the novel talks about what is happening to the Gujar community in the Kagan Valley. And ice mating is not something fictitious. As you can see, if you look up articles, there are geologists and scientific studies on ice rafting, ice mating, as a relatively successful strategy that locals have devised, not just in Pakistan, and if I'm not wrong, maybe in India or Nepal also, as a way of dealing with climate change. So the novel just captures, I think, a part of that reality and brings it to the consciousness of the reader vis-a-vis the story itself.
Quick responses from the speakers.
So I think Nanika's question on the politics of humor, yeah, that's what it was. Yes. So of course, this is very much a work in progress. You know, a lot of these ideas I'm sort of really thinking through. So one is the politics of censorship. This is a very, and location, right? You know, so it goes, I think now more than ever, it's really coming down, even within the country, it is really a question of location. What is the immediate state that you are under? What are the various levels of privilege in terms of class, caste, etc., that will protect you, if at all? So even this politics of who is going to be able to critique the state, who is going to be able to do this art, who is even going to be able to put up, So there were things I didn't mention. For instance, even the idea of the archive, right? Like so, there in this region, there have been instances of of community putting up a small makeshift museum and then there being a lot of trouble over it. So yes, so this whole question of the politics of humor, who is able to tell the stories, yes, I mean, this is, I think this should actually be a whole section, if I'm allowed to tell it. So, but thank you for the question. It's definitely something I'm going to think about.
Okay. Yeah, so the first question, I do ethnographic work, and so my mother's from Sikkim, and so it's a place that's very familiar to me. I didn't grow up there, and her family's she belongs to the Lepcha community, though not from Zongu or North Sikkim. So I first started doing research there in 2007 when I did my master's, and then I've been I haven't been able to do field work more recently because of COVID. So I mean, I don't think the anti-dam activists are reading Catherine Yusof or all these scholars, but there's definitely so I mentioned how they were able to pressure the state to cancel the projects, and they were doing that with the help of a lot of national, international activists. So the Medha Patkar and International Rivers and all these organizations. So they also participated then in anti-dam kind of activist conferences outside. So there's in Mexico City, met other indigenous scholars and activists, mostly activists. So I don't think it's when you talk about local or place-based communities, it's not that they're people were using social media, and people are making films and documentaries. So it's a very kind of a scene, and Parshmita was talking about this. There's a lot of kind of work happening, not just in Sikkim, but Darjeeling, West Bengal region. So even the reason why the dams were cancelled were not just on spiritual grounds, but on environmental and grounds, because it was close to the Kanchenjunga Biosphere Reserve. So, so it's these activists are actually drawing on legal, hydrological, geological. If you sit and talk to them, they know, they know so much about how the river works, but because they've had to constantly, negotiate with so many different actors. So they wouldn't know these theories, and I think I'm learning from them. And all this question of sacred landscapes and stuff is me seeing this in this context and being hey, this really resonates with what I'm reading, here. So. And to Nanika's question about indigenous, the term is obviously contested. It's not accepted by the Indian state, and it's a term that is notoriously difficult to pin down and define. And people have tried it, and mostly, people have said that it's impossible to define it, and it has to be something that is very place-based and context specific. So in the Indian context, people talk about the ST status, with the scheduled tribe status, which is a constitutional idea, but it doesn't map onto, ideas of indigeneity because tribes move. So even the Lepcha's claims to indigeneity, that in itself is not contested, but it's something that has gotten them a disproportionate amount of attention because there's other communities that are also protesting against these projects, but they're classified as Nepali, so they are not seen as from Sikkim. So, there's this, and even though, these borders were very porous, so people are saying Nepali people aren't indigenous to this region. So that also has been contested. But indigeneity, I think the question of marginalization, this experience of marginalization is very key to that. And that's something that the communities experienced, not just from the Indian state, but also the experience of the Namgyal monarchy, and feeling like their language especially was something that was erased. So, which is, I think, a very common experience across indigenous communities.
Mabel, shall we take another round of
Yeah.
questions? Mona, Rupali, and Anu. Is there a mic? Yes.
Can you hear me? Thank you for this wonderful set of presentations. I actually had a very similar question to Khatri, so you sort of responded to that in your answer, what insurgent geology actually looks like, in the everyday. That was what I was really trying to get at. What's interesting to me though is, as Kashmiri scholars, we also rely so much on theoretical frameworks that come to us from North America, from Australia. But it's interesting, right, that the Northeastern scholars in Northeast, scholars of the Northeast and Kashmir we've had these long conversations, right, about the nature of political violence in those regions that actually connects us. But we haven't really talked about geologies that connect us. We haven't really talked about mountain forms and, the fact that the NHPC thinks that Kashmir provides a head, and so does the Northeast, for power generation. What does that head do as a geological feature, but also as an ideological claim? We haven't really talked about that, and it's sort of, I'm curious, this is not really a question, but I'm curious how that conversation can actually develop further. But having said that, I was just wondering, coming back to indigeneity, and coming to your reluctance to use settler colonialism as a framework, and understandably so, but I want to know a little bit more about what that reluctance is. I also am very curious to hear a little bit more about how this notion of indigeneity and what that is. You can root it in legal codes, you can talk about notions of marginality and how that sort of infuses indigeneity with some meaning. But what about the nature of state violence itself becoming a frame of reference for how people think of themselves as indigenous and why they think of themselves as indigenous? So I want to know a little bit more about the nature of the state's violence and how you capture that, and what vocabularies you might use to capture that, so that indigeneity becomes not sort of a standalone term, but something that is in conversation, dynamic conversation with the nature of state violence.
Rupali up here. Yeah, so this is not a question so much, but a response to Sonal, your publication, I think, which is very interesting. What does theorizing from South Asia look like? And perhaps, I don't know, this is just a suggestion that perhaps really, there's some very interesting ideas that have come up in the last 2 days. And what if there is a work in progress glossary that we're able to build from here? There are a series of terms that we're seeing coming up. This, we saw impermanence, incoherence, incrementality, the idea of the trickster figure, the idea of spirits and fragile archives and geopoetics. There are several ideas that are coming up here. Perhaps this, if by the end of 3 days, if they're able to perhaps even put together, I wouldn't claim to have a glossary at the end of this, because that's too much, but also a work in progress glossary would be interesting for us to develop in the next 3 days, I think. So this was the question.
I want to thank you all for these great papers, and also echo Khatri's point, because I work in representation, and I think I learned a lot from your presentation. I wanted to get back to Sonal's provocation about long processes of myth-making, and also what stories are, not only what stories are we telling, but what are we retelling, how are we retelling. That to me was a very important part of this panel. I work actually largely in African studies and Black studies. And so I really draw on this concept of reparative re-narration, which I saw in all three papers. But I think I wanted to ask very particularly, how now do we use the horizon of the nation state as a bridge between old forms of telling stories and these ways that I think all three of these papers are trying to re-narrate? Because I don't think we're done with the horizon of the nation state, in which lots of indigenous actors all over the world have had to perform, but these particularly South Asian actors, both the state and these communities that I think you're all working with, are having to deal with in very different ways. I mean, we know these stories of Hindutva, indigeneity, and we also know, about Adivasi communities who have been trying to work with their own indigeneity and have solidarity across the world, but also be very particular to their own ecologies. I know that that's a very big question, but I really would like to maybe also put it to the whole audience, but put it to the three of you. Is the nation, are we done with the nation state, or how do we process its death and burial?
May I use my position and privilege as the moderator of this session, and in consultation with other organizers, it wasn't a unilateral decision. What we're going to do in the interest of time, because we really have 2 minutes left, is to take one more round of questions and comments, and then invite everyone to continue the conversation with our panelists, except for Sabah, who I think we might lose on the Zoom link, over coffee. So I have Nida, Iftikhar, and Lalita. If you can be really quick, you're the last one in. All right, so Nida, Iftikhar, Lalita.
I can be super quick too. It's a very particular question from Asmita's very beautiful text, and the last part specifically about dissent in arts and the work and project you're thinking about, which I found very powerful. I wanted to ask about fragments, how you're thinking, and a little bit more sort of understanding about the use and political significance of the fragment, vis-a-vis or with respect to a broader discussion about recovery and erasure that we've been talking about, and thinking about where the fragment becomes politically powerful as opposed to a sort of a bigger scopic process of recovery. And sort of leaving that aside, where the very last bit of your presentation, one thing that came very powerfully out was that just by revealing the fragment, you are also revealing the violence of its erasure. That you're making that super clear, like the censorship and the erasure is brought out because you have to only deal with the fragment or the remain. So yeah, I'm very interested in that and would love to hear more.
Thank you, everyone, for great presentations. Just I'll be very quick. So one is, of course, that, the question of indigeneity. I mean, I'm just thinking that, there was, of course, Canada sovereignty and strategic initiatives. I mean, all of those debates, that are at an earlier moment, and I wonder if we are still, whether we are really beyond that, or, whether those kind of debates still have a purchase on questions of kind of indigeneity. I mean, one of the things, that, is that I know you've not done, like you said that you haven't done the feedback, but I wonder if the indigenous, like, left is one community, right? In other words, is it to just speak with one voice, or is it as phenomena like what MBA had suggested, that half the people are living in Paris and New York and so on. So in other words, where is the voice? Is it one voice, right? And so, again, the question of whether it's, the indigeneity becomes recognizable vis-a-vis state formation and politics of recognition, right? So that's one set of questions. And Sabah, as I know that you, just picking up on Katherine's question and your response, which is to say that you are bringing other kind of debates from climate science and so on into this analysis of this novel and this phenomena. But within the novel itself, is it? Do you think it's a work of fiction? Do you think it's a kind of a mirror to reality? Are the voices being the voices again of, are they kind of, ventriloquizing for the community? Are they kind of creative acts? Or are they mimetic, kind of voices? I mean, I think that the question of form remains, central. I think, in other words, what's the difference between a novel and a fever, right? As a form of narration.
Quick. I'm just coming back. Thank you for your papers. It was very productive. I'm also responding to Sonal's cracks and bursts as one of the ways of connecting. So I have this question. I'm sort of curious about this. I'm sorry, it sort of seems like a contrarian, but I do want to ask this question. So much of all of this appears to be about large-scale projects, like dams and hydroelectric in some fashion or another, right? Because we're wondering about older techniques and the longer history through roadways and helipads in this mountain region as forms of state violence. So in a sense, I think we've spent so much of our time talking about dams, not just you, but I mean, we've been sort of, this has been the South Asian obsession. But we've forgotten other forms of state intrusion and prime dominion sort of assertions that they've had over the years. So sort of like I think the logic from building a road through an expressway or a highway, just a small roadway, the end logic of it is to have a huge dam. I think that's the logic. Okay, so I don't know where that puts me. I mean, the train lines are a minor matter, but I think it's the roadways. And that's the question on. And to some extent, it connects to the question of form, which I cannot ask in its fullest form right now. Okay, thank you.
All right, with that wonderful set of provocations and questions, let me invite you all to join me in a round of applause for our panelists and to continue the conversation outside.